All right, and welcome back to another episode of Conquest Corner. The goal of this is to just go through all the various things from Parabellum's Games Conquest, The Last Argument of Kings. There was some interest last time in doing a deeper discussion related to, at the time asked about, was the Drum Beast and the Tonsor. I thought about that, went through, did it, enjoyed doing it, so I thought I would do the same sort of thing for some of these other factions. The way I want to do this, rather than just talking about one individual unit, because not enough to go on there, I want to be able to make a comparison. What I figure I'll do, most of the things in this game, the boxes are dual kits. So it makes sense if you're a dual kit to talk about the two different sides, why you might build one option or the other, where to kind of see in terms of the army, playstyles, all those sorts of ideas. So what I thought I would do for this one is actually not a dual kit. They're two individual kits, but I think they're comparable for the positions they sit in, what they are, and everything like that. So in this particular one, as you saw in the title, we're going to be talking from the Old Dominion. We're going through the Bone Golems and the Buccephaloi. So the thought is to discuss both of these, discuss where they go, how do they fit, what kind of list do you put them in, why do I like one over the other, all those sort of thoughts. And as we go along, I'll be honest, I'm probably going to do Old Dominion first because it's the one I know the best. However, if there's a particular unit breakdown, anything like that you want to see, if you're on the YouTube, you can put it in the comments below. I'll read through it. A popularity contest. If there's something people want talked about, that's what I'll go to next, obviously. I might have to do a little bit of research and thinking about it first. Some of them I know a lot more comfortably than others, but I'll absolutely do any of that work that's required. So as you can see, maybe a little bit in the background, again, if you're watching on YouTube, there's a little bit of Christmas stuff up around because it is still the holiday season. And since it is, if you're interested in getting into any of these armies, Parabellum Games is still running some very good deals. Depending on when you listen to this, they may be done in your area. If not, I know there's some pre-orders that are starting soon for some nice looking releases in January. Nothing for my factions, but hey, that saves me some money, which is quite good. But if there's any of those that you're interested in, we do have down beneath below a code that you can use as well as a link. You use the code, it's Terrain Kickers on their web store. You can hit the link to be able to get into it as well. Anything that you purchase from that, you do get 10% off and you do help support the show as well. So it's a little bit for both of us, which is, quite nice. Now, without further ado, let's get into these units a little bit here. So what I want to start with is just who actually even takes them, because this is a game, since you take things in terms of warbands and not everyone has access to everything, it doesn't make sense to make the discussion about these units unless we talk about where you're actually going to put them. The warband part might be a little cut off. I'll read through it and I'll talk about it, but the sizing of the windows, I don't have to resize them like 5 times here. And again, I am displaying all this for anyone who's watching on YouTube, but if you're just listening to this on the podcast or anything like that, I'll talk through the things that we're seeing as well, so that way you can understand what it is. You just don't get to see the nice little army builder that Parabellum Games has put together. All right, so the Bone Golem. For the Bone Golem, your only option is the Archimandrite. Now, for me personally, that's a pretty good option. Now, the Archimandrite, I will say, is sort of the only option for several choices. This isn't just for this case. We're going to see, especially when we talk about Moroi and Cares and all of that, that this is the spot where you take these sort of things. You have some play in some other spots, not really. I believe the Hierodeacon... No, actually, my apologies, it is literally just the Archimandrite. I thought the Hierodeacon could take one. I think of the Hierodeacon as she. Doesn't matter. It's a weird... not even a person thing, but I always usually say that. So the Archimandrite locks a lot of these choices away. So if you want to take Bone Golems, you're taking it as a restricted choice. If you're taking Archimandrite, though, you're going to put it in a unit of Legionnaires, probably. You could put them in Cultists. I'm thinking more Legionnaires. Personally, also Cultists aren't out yet. And then you can grab your Bone Golems. That means your absolute maximum Bone Golems is ever 2 units, because the only option is a restricted for the Archimandrite. However, for your Buccephaloi, you have options of the Fallen Divinity, which is a whole playstyle unto itself. I'll get into a little bit of that idea here. I'm not going to go too deep dive on the Fallen Divinity right now, but I'll do that in a future episode if that's what people want. I've played her quite a few times. It is a main state choice, partially because the Fallen Divinity doesn't have restricted choices. The Fallen Divinity may take 2 regiments. Whatever type, that she doesn't have to be able to join them or anything like that. So you could actually take 2 units of Buccephaloi here if you wanted. You can also take some other choices as well. The Hierodeacon does take them as well, but it takes the Buccephaloi, again, in this case, as a restricted option. because it's not the super special, essentially leader of the whole army kind of thing. For your higher deacons, I tend to put that in a unit of cultists because I want board presence early. I want turn 1 to be able to start pumping up my dark power pool or the Fallen Divinities pool, whichever one I'm worried about at the moment. So I do that. Hey, Buccephaloi as my restricted option. So if you're wanting these units, these are the options you're running. Now, for me personally, I think an Archimandrite and or Higher Deacon are very good choices just in the army in general. I tend not to run either of them as my Warlord. One, Higher Deacon you're not allowed to, but also Archimandrite, I just personally don't tend to. The extra spell is nice, but I have other ways to get extra spells. I kind of like more what their Strategos or maybe Ziliarch does, depending on exactly what you take. If you take the Fallen Divinity, obviously, that's how you run your Warlord. So that's how you're going to take these units. And we'll get a little bit into the ways they support them and their options once we get into it a little bit more. But let's take a look at the two units themselves and kind of start getting into it. They're both heavy brutes. They're both comparable in base points, 210 to 220. So no realistic difference. 10 points, that's nothing in this game. I often have a spare 10 points or 20 points and I throw it on some banners or upgrades like that. Both move 6, both base defense 3, both attacks 4. Where it starts to vary, the Bone Golems are only a Clash 2, where Buccephaloi are Clash 3, so Buccephaloi are more reliable on their hits. Bone Golems have an extra wound, they're 6 wounds compared to the Buccephaloi's 5. And Buccephaloi actually do have an evasion. They actually have evade 2, which is exceedingly good and has saved my, proverbial bacon. I mean, they're essentially undead minotaurs, has served my bacon many, many times. The reason being, defense 3 is very nice unless someone has a good cleave number. And both of the units kind of work off the idea that they have good cleaves. Buccephaloi in particular have a cleave of 3, the other one's a 2, and we'll get into more of their stats in a second. But an evade of 2 means I always have at least a 2. And there's many cases where someone has, say, cleave of 2, or maybe 3, or something else, or, oh, you don't get defense because of some special rules they have, or other things, either stuff that's out or could come out. So being able to have that evasion has absolutely kept some of them alive in the past. And I find sometimes with these units, you don't need that many left over to really hit the enemy hard. All right. The Clash is obviously the biggest difference between these two. The extra wound is nice. 1 extra wound is a huge difference here, although when we think of Archimandrites being able to heal, 1 extra wound means you need to be able to get to that spot to heal them back a little bit more readily. Remember, you have to be able to heal at least half, so their wound healing, if a full stand is gone, is both 3 for each. But for the Buccephaloi, if you've only taken a little bit of a wound, maybe 1 wound or 2, you have a better shot at getting a full stand back than you might for the Bone Golems. Not a big difference, but something to think about. Let's go through their special rules, and let's see why we like them the way they do. For cleave numbers, I said Bone Golems are 2, whereas your Buccephaloi are 3. Bone Golems get Relentless Blows. For anyone who doesn't know, Relentless Blows means when you're, for them doing a clash, it would be a duel as well, but they don't duel. When you get a clash, your 1s cause an extra hit. So every single time you get a 1, you get an extra hit. They're both unstoppable, so everyone's getting to reroll charges. Your Bone Golems have Hardened 1, so they're defense 3, but they ignore 1 of the opponent's cleave or brutal impact or any of essentially their rules that try to cut through you. Armor piercing is the other one. This does mean if they have things like Line Breaker that you lose that, but that's not quite as common. All right, so Bone Golems have Aura of Death. Essential Aura of Death does, if you start, so you draw your command card and you're in contact with a unit with Aura of Death, then you take the number of hits equal to their Aura of Death value times how many of my stands that you're in contact with. So if it's a normal 3 unit and you're hitting all of my stands with your regiment, then you're taking 9 of them. It mentions that this happens after they draw the card, but before they end up doing draw events. And this even happens even if they decide not to activate them. The fact of pulling the card makes this occur. If I destroy you in this part, then you get to draw another card. You essentially get to go again. So they do mention that that is a thing for this. And they talk about if you're garrisoned, then nothing happens. Remember, this no longer causes morale checks. It used to. That's no longer a thing anymore. All right, so they have that. They have Impact 2. That's the same as the Buccephaloi. So they both have the Impact. The difference is the Buccephaloi have Brutal Impact 1. So The impacts are better on the Buccephaloi. They're both animate vessel. They're both terrifying 1. So that's the overall of base rules. I want to talk about that before we get into memories of old, because I think that's a discussion to have. All right. So Cleave 2 versus Cleave 3 is a huge difference. Obviously, if you go into someone with evade, who cares? Let's say you're not going into things with evades. Cleave 3 means that most things outside of stuff from Dweg or something that has a high defense with shields and all of that, most things get very little to almost no save whatsoever. Whereas Cleave 2, that 1 extra I find does make a sizable difference, especially if someone actually has hardened on them as well. With the way they redid Dweghome, getting hardened instead of having a little bit less defense but hardened, getting the extra cleave absolutely helps you get through them. So that +1 difference is very noticeable, very important. The other big thing is the brutal impact. So impact hits are great, but if you get your full saves, I'm not as concerned about that. Now, if we think of, there's tons of ways you can get impact hits in this game. If we think of some of the lighter units, if we think of some of the light Nord units that can do it, or the Wadroon, which we did before, I'm essentially just trying to get you down with weight of dice. I'm not really worried about having the brutal part. I'm just going to hit you with tons and tons of impact. And when I'm aiming those units, I'm not aiming at your heavy hitters, or at least your well-armored heavy hitters, because my units don't stand up to that. These two are different, though. For these two, I'm looking to hit your heavy units because of my Cleave 2/Cleave 3. Because I don't have that many attacks realistically, because for their costs, I'm not going to be running like 8 stands of either of them, or 7 stands of either of them, which means that I need to be able to make maximum effect with minimum attacks, which means I want to be hitting people with good defenses because I have a good way through the defense. Which means if I rush in with Bone Golems impacting 2, even if I roll really well and they got a lot of hits, you're probably having good defense. That Brutal Impact 1, which can become a Brutal Impact 2 with a Memory of Old, can make a very big difference. That means if I rush in, I can get a decent number through to begin with, because the clash number comes into play. We'll talk about that in a second. And I'm actually going to be carving through you again. If you have a defense, I'm lowering it by 2. That means I'm going to get results. When we talk about that, and we'll mention this here briefly, the Bone Golems extra is an extra Aura of Death. Aura of Death 4 is very good. Again, I think that we're going to see they have a little bit of a different purpose, even though I think the Bone Golems should fit 1 slot. I think they actually fit a different purpose than the Buccephaloi. When I look at these guys, so when I do that direct comparison, the biggest problem that Bone Golems run into is their clash value of 2. 2 is terrible. Now, that's pretty common for a lot of our base units in this army. We got a lot of Clash 2s, and they do that because we get a lot of bonuses, all these extra rules. We don't resolve, so we stick around a lot more. So essentially, we tend to hit a little bit less. 2 versus 3 is very, very meaningful, and here's a few reasons why. So when I think of their uses of each, I think of the Buccephaloi as wanting to go into the very tough units. Bone Golems, I don't do the same way. So, when I think of the 2 versus 3, let's assume that you charged. Let's assume a 3-pack of each because they're pretty equivalent in points. The Buccephaloi are more expensive by 10 points additional per stand, so they'll go up higher in cost. But again, I'm not too concerned with that. It's appropriate. So, let's say you charged in, you're inspired, all of that. First things first, your impacts don't benefit from the expired, which means if we're looking at a 3-pack, with impact 2 on those Buccephaloi, then you're looking at 6 going in, you're hitting with about half of them, you're looking at about 3. Your brutal impact 1, potentially 2, if you have memories of old. Let's assume you have your memories of old, because there's good ways to get it early, and we'll talk about that. Which means you have, on average, 3, that they have -2 to their saves, so they're probably saving on 1s to maybe 2s at max. You should get 1 to 2 through. They might be saving on worse. Should get 1 to 2 through. They're resolving on that. You might get an extra 1. So you're looking at probably 2-ish wounds on average that you're looking at there. Again, their saves, their stats, all that can vary, but you should be able to get a few through. However, when we look at the Bone Golems, they're only hitting 1/3 of the time. So they're probably only on average going to get about 2 hits. They're losing about a hit on average. With no brutal impact means you're getting your full saves. So if you're hitting someone with a save, essentially, you might get a wound in. Reasonable chance that they have an okay save. Maybe you don't get any. Even if you do, the resolve, there's a chance they don't take it. So you're looking at that impact on the Buccephaloi actually getting you some results. It could take a couple wounds off. Now, you could spike, of course, and you could spike and take down a whole stand. But on average, you should be able to take 2 to maybe 3 wounds off. So being terrifying, of course, usually helps. Now you go and swing. They both have the base number of attacks of 4. You charged in. Your Bone Golems now are hitting on 3s. So they're hitting half. They do have relentless blows, which means if you roll 1s, you do get an extra hit on 4 dice per stand, because that's what we're looking at. We're looking at per stand amount here. On 4 dice, it's about 50%, a little bit more, but it's about 50% that you get at least 1-1. Obviously, the odds of only getting a single one is different, but we're talking about you could get more than one. So it's about 50%. So we're looking at a stand. You're hitting about half with about half a chance of at least 1-1. We could average it to about 3 hits. For these, I'm going to do some glossing over some of the stats. I'm not doing the pure exact breakdowns. If people are more interested in that, let me know in the comments below on YouTube. I can go through any of that if you want. I can do statistical analysis on more of this stuff, but I'm trying to keep it a little more high level because I think in these decisions, when they're reasonably close, that's not a fun way to pick what to take. They're pretty good army-wise. They both have a good purpose in my army. I like the look of this better. That's a good reason to take it. Not this one does 0.3 hits more. To me, that's not fun. So you're looking at about 3 hits. On average, you have cleave 2. You could get a decent amount of wounds through. You could get your terrifying, the resolve. You can get some through there. And again, that's about per stand. When you look at the Buccephaloi, they're now hitting on 4s with their 4 attacks. They should average themselves about 3 as well. Again, it's not exactly 3. And relentless blows can spike. I remember one time I was playing Horus Heresy, and my Praetor hits on 2s, and I rolled 4 dice, and he rolled 4 1s, which, if you know anything about GW games, 1s are what you don't want. For this game, I would have been amazing. I would have doubled my amount of hits. But we're going averages because I've also had plenty of times with my Bone Golems after a charge, when I'm hitting on 2s, that I roll 4 dice on a guy, and I get nothing. I roll for 12 dice on a unit of 3 of them, and I get like 3 hits, because I roll just high numbers. I've also had cases where I roll those 12 dice and I get 12, 13, 14 hits. So relentless blows allows you to spike more, but it's very unreliable. It just depends on what you roll. If you don't roll well, it's not going to help you at all. So they're both on average getting about the same amount of hits per stand. However, the extra cleave means more wounds. I've had many cases where that extra cleave means the opponent gets no save. This was especially good going into some units of dinosaurs that have essentially like defense 3s. You have no save. I just, whatever I do is flat damage to you. So overall, from the charge and hit, Buccephaloi tend to hit a little bit harder. Makes sense, they're a little bit more, but they tend to hit a bit harder. The brutal impact helps a lot, as well as the extra cleave. Protracted combat is a little bit of a different toss-up. Buccephaloi have less wounds, a little bit less in terms of defense, but since they hit naturally better, they're going to cause more damage over time. However, the Bone Golems do have the Aura Death, so if your opponent does activate on you, and their save is not great, Aura Death is the sort of thing, since it no longer causes morale, your terrifying won't help you. Aura Death means I either get a lot from it or little. If you have good defenses, it's not going to do anything to you. If you don't, though, I'm going to hit into you. So, in terms of long term, the Bone Golems are probably doing all their damage from Aura Death. I've had plenty of times when I roll those dice, it just doesn't happen. Now, if you happen to be in turns when you're always inspired, so if you're at now tier 3 in your Dark Power pool, we have a little bit more leeway with them. But for protracted combats, I tend to like the Buccephaloi more for what I send them into. The Bone Golems, I want to send them into things that are a bit lighter, because that's where I want them. The enemy could be a bigger hitter because they're a little bit more defensive, unless they cleave. If they cleave, I'd rather have Buccephaloi. However, when looking at it, that harden really does help and all, so they're a bit of a toss-up. So overall, personally, I've been running Buccephaloi a lot more. One, I enjoyed painting them more. Bone Golems had so many little knickknacks all over them, they were a slog to paint. I don't enjoy finicky models of painting, so partly I've been running Buccephaloi more. So let's get into a little bit of how we supplement them and where I see them, because I honestly see them in very, very different places. I think there's a place for both, and I'll talk about if you only take one, which one I would take. So if we're taking a look at, say, the Bone Golems, because that's easier. Got to take an Archimandrite to be able to take these. So I want to talk about what the Archimandrite can do for them. The Archimandrite is your caster. Yes, Hierarchy can cast a little bit as well, but it doesn't really do a whole lot for the rest of the things. Hierarchy is where this, the Archimandrite is where this is at. Remember, you do have ways to be able to cast 2 spells. I almost always take the extra upgrade so I can do that. In particular, I'm forgetting the name right now. Where is it? Why am I forgetting the thing? The one that lets you do it. Is it a blessing? I bet it's a blessing. Is that why I'm not thinking of it? Not tactical, combat, arcane, unholy mastery. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. Unholy mastery just means if you get 4 or more successes, you may cast again. If you take a high enough retinue, you're going to be on 7 dice with 1 on success, often needing 3s for your spells. You'll get to the 4. You'll be able to cast 2. So you'll be able to heal and then do something else. For Bone Golems, obviously, Archimandrites heal. That's a huge facet of what they do, and healing these sort of units up can really demoralize an opponent. When we think of other things that we're doing for them, sorry, not that one. Blasphemous Power is always a good one, because that lets you be 1 tier higher. Casting this early, I find, so the way I usually run, I run a Hierodeacon early to smack down one of my units, and the Archimandrite goes later to heal that unit back up and then cast a spell. If you're close enough for Blasphemous Power and your Bone Golems are already stuck in, they get extra Aura of Death. Remember, Aura of Death from this sort of thing is overcut out, but one way that it gets this is Blasphemous Power means that you count as 1 tier higher. So you can get to the tier 2, count as a draw event, you can have your Aura of Death, you can go early with them, hit something, and then when they hit you back, you got an extra Aura of Death. Or, realistically, for when these guys come in, you might be now at tier 2, this puts you to tier 3, now you're inspired, now you're hitting stronger. The other option is your Dark Immolation. They go up, it makes your Aura of Death go up, the limit is 5, you're currently on 3, 4, so early game this is more meaningful, late game it really doesn't do you much, but you do get the extra early Aura of Death. Now, Aura of Death only matters if you're already stuck in combat, and if you get to do some of these bonuses to get the extra before they go. This does mean you could have an Archimandrite go early, get you potentially to that Aura of Death 5, and then your Bone Golems could be saved for later, because their memory of old won't matter for the time being. You could wait for a bit on that. And if you're willing to wait on that for a bit, that's useful. Actually, in this... any regiment affected by the spell has its Aura of Death to a maximum of 5. So remember, if you have the spell, your own Aura of Death won't go up higher. It's not that the spell caps to 5, it's that having the spell on you is a total cap of 5. So, for these guys. Now, there's not a lot of other buffs that other people can do to them. The Hierodeacon doesn't buff as much. You can't really put characters in here. So, we're kind of looking at this as your buffing options for them. So when I take a look at Bone Golems, what I see them best for, these are not going into the high defense options. I know you have a cleave of 2, but on your bad to hit and all early, and your Aura of Death, if they have high defense, you're probably just going to get torn down. You might be able to tie them down if that's your bigger concern. But we have better options to be able to get into the heavy hitters, defensively at least. If someone is very offensive-minded, but isn't the best in terms of their defense, that's where these want to go. Move 6 is pretty fast, So speed isn't too much of a problem, I find. The Cleave 2 does help to make sure that whatever I hit doesn't get much of a save, if anything, unless they have a good evade. But the Hardened with 6 wounds on defense 3 and Aura Death means if you don't have a great save, you're a little bit more glass cannon-y for what I'm going against, means that when they activate, I could deal a decent amount of damage to them. I'm pretty defensive for the hit back. And then later when I go, I can now pile on the damage to be able to take down those bits of stands that I have. I find Bone Golems don't hit nearly as hard as you think they will. The Relentless Blows is nice, but often they just don't do the output. Where they do the output is that Aura Death. But Aura Death is only going to help if I can actually put the damage on you, which means not good saves. Where I see these guys hitting opponents that have an armor of maybe an overall save of about a 2, which is quite a few units. There's quite a few units that hit hard with armor 2s, maybe an armor 3. I would never want to go against anyone at 3 in a shield or anything like that, or with very high evade numbers. So I see them being supported great by the Archimandrite. I see the Archimandrite wanting to be near them, because the Archimandrite usually I don't want in the front lines. The Archimandrite, I'm going to take that 40-point upgrade. I'm going to usually send out a heal to someone. If an enemy is close enough, then I'm going to do Unholy Baptism to start hitting them with some armor-piercing damage. And then, if it's early game, I bump someone's tier up so they get their Memories of Old. I often do it on my Cataphracti, but here's not a bad idea either. Or I'll do Dark Immolation to get them to that Aura Death 5. If they're in a spot for that to really do some damage, if you're a 3 block, that's 15 auto hits. Even if you have very good saves, that's still going to be some real damage. So I see them as going a little bit more for the glass cannon, a little bit more for the lighter, or crowd control. Hit them into things that, yeah, your other units could take, but they might take a while. These ones can carve through it, or they'll sit there. These units are great on objectives. Let the opponent hit you, or hit into them, sit on the objective, let your Aura Death do the damage, let your survivability be there, and let someone else come in for cleanup as necessary. When you think about our army in general, it's essentially our special units that you need to really dish damage out. Our base ones that you take, your Legionnaires, just scrolling through yet. When I think of Legionnaires, when I think of some of the other light choices, not really damage dealers. Praetorian Guard, not really damage dealers. We need our special options, often heavies. So this is a good option for that. You are restricted a bit with the fact that the Archimandrite is the only one that can take it. I do think that hurts. I think it's perfectly fitting, but I do think that hurts. For Bone Golems, I never usually take more than 4. I find 4 does enough. I will often take them in a line. Sometimes I make them as a 4 block to at least get in. I'll line them out later if I didn't do in the beginning, but I never go above that. Personally, I just think you're putting way too many points. I said other buffs, not really. I don't think there's a whole lot else that buffs them. Obviously, Warlord traits can be able to get the free reform. If you take a Strategos as your Warlord is great. Counting as an extra tier higher is really good because now you can get your Memory of Old early. Not as important, but good. Zilliarch 1 doesn't help you at all. Fallen Divinity doesn't help you at all for its thing. Obviously, there's some other good stuff Fallen Divinity can do that supports it, but I'm not going to go through all those little nuances here. When we take a look at the Buccephaloi, so Archimandrite helps the Buccephaloi in very, very similar ways. Getting your extra brutal impact from your Memories of Old by taking the Blasphemous Power helps a lot. Because now Brutal Impact 2 means this is the unit that goes into the very heavy defensive units. Things that you want to take down. With an evade of 2 means that you're still very survivable because no matter how hard they hit, you're on 2s usually. Let's ignore some weird special cases of dumb stuff that could happen. But you're on 2s, and 2s is actually still really, really good. Especially when you remember, you don't resolve. So they're going to have a hard time chewing 5 wounds at a time if you always get 2s to save. The extra brutal impact means that these guys will hit in. They do need that charge. But they will hit in, and they will crush people. Having abilities to heal is really good. Again, these guys are a little bit easier to heal multiples of. Because at higher levels, you can be healing, 4, maybe 5, and that's really going to heal up 1 to 2 stands, where the other ones you're only ever really going to get 1, depending on how the numbers look. It's a little bit easier on this, especially if you've taken more than like 1 wound on a guy. Other spots I see, obviously giving them Aura Death is fine. You can actually give that to them. The Dark Immolation doesn't care what it gives you. So you can absolutely put Aura Death onto them, which is a cool thing. I usually just don't do it, but you absolutely can. I usually want to put it in other spots. But what's nice with this is, 1, you don't have to take an Archimandrite to run this. You do have some options. If you're taking Fallen Divinity, these are great in Fallen Divinity. Fallen Divinity, I find, wants heavy hitters and then things that just go sit on objectives. The Fallen Divinity rushes forward with these guys at the helm as well. These guys hit the things that would actually hurt the Divinity, which could actually get through it, especially if your Divinity is not tier 3 yet. They hit that, either take it out or tie it down, so your Divinity can go and chomp down the lighter targets until it's a tier 3, and then it cuts through anyone it feels like. So I do think these guys are great there. I think this, whether unit of Caratids or maybe Canaphores, is really, really good for Divinity. So the buffs, equally good, in some ways better, because the Brutal Impact I like a little bit more personally. Like I said, Higher Deacon doesn't really buff, not really the same sort of way. There's some options related to it, but not really of what it's going to do. But if you're running a list that's trying to ramp up your speed, Higher Deacons are almost a must-take, which means that you can take this unit for reasonably cheap, because you can take Higher Deacon with a unit of Cultists, you get them out early, you're starting to up your Dark Power pool, and then you have a cheaper way to get your Buccephaloi out. I find the Higher Deacon, I don't put nearly as many upgrades. The Archimandrite needs to do work, so the Archimandrite's going to get close to 200 points the way I usually run it. Or Higher Deacon, I usually take maybe Arcane level 1. If I got the spare points, I'll go up higher. But Arcane level 1, get me that extra die is pretty good. If I go higher, sure. So, and these guys are well supported by other things. So again, your Strategos is your leader. Then you get a Reform. These guys on Reform is really good. So normally these guys I run minimum 4, often 5. 1, they are more expensive. But I find if I hit them into or get near the targets I want, they absolutely make up their points. And they're survivable enough, especially if you run 5, that if someone hits you and gets takes a stand out, maybe 2 stands, you still have enough to be able to swing back with. Again, because if you're stuck in combat on Cleave 3, maybe 4 if you're inspired, because if you're a high enough tier. Clash, I should say, Clash 3, maybe 4, because of high enough tier, with a Cleave 3, I'm going to get wounds into you. Unless you have a good evade, you are taking a lot of wounds back. That's a battle I don't mind getting into. So I see Buccephaloi as wanting to hit much heavier targets. I don't want to put my Bone Golems into them. I've had them stall out far too many times. My Buccephaloi never stall me. Now, yeah, you could roll terrible dice, but in general, they're getting through people. I've had them take down plenty of dinosaurs. I've had them take down plenty of giants or Jotnars, plenty of whatever comes their way. There's very few things that can stand up against them. I do find I like a group of minimum of 4. I often run 5. I tend to have an Archimandrite as well, so I can heal them up, so I can keep them in fighting shape. This is a unit that I like not to come in until that turn 4, where I can start them on the side of the board, because then they can be there, and on turn 5, they're rushing into someone. They're often my first activation turn 5. If they have to run in from board edge, they can still get up 12. They're often still a very early activation in that turn 4 once they're a legal target, or like I said, turn 5 if that's when they become legal targets for charging. So the extra addition of where you can put them, I think, helps them. I said, we'll go through Fallen Divinity lists. If anyone's interested, let me know. I will go through my Fallen Divinity list, how I put it together, the thoughts behind it, all my sort of decisions. All right, to keep this a little bit on the shorter side, so where do I see them? When I take a look at these, I said, we talked about how I see them as serving different purposes. Personally, I prefer Buccephaloi. I think this army has some decent ways to deal with lighter targets, or glass cannons, or things that the Bone Golems excel at a little bit better. I think when I think of our light units, our Cares and Moroi can go well against those sort of things. I think Caratids with their shooting attacks can do well into that. I think even if you take a look at Anatheti do well against lighter targets because they get tons of attacks with Flurry, so they're going to get the hits in. If you don't have a great save, they'll cut through you. However, our big heavy hitters is much lower. Varangian Guard is the other heavy hitter. Now, Varangian Guard serve a bit of a different purpose to me because you can put a Zilliarch in there, you can put your leader in there. Now, that might be your Warlord, and if you're running as your Warlord, they could get 2 swings. You're doing a little bit something different. I often do take Buccephaloi and Varangian Guard. I rarely, if ever, take both of these, Buccephaloi and Bone Golems. And lately, I just haven't taken my Bone Golems. For what we have out now and for what I find I need, I have options that aren't Bone Golems that can do the job reasonably well. However, I don't have as many things that do the job that the Buccephaloi do. The other problem with Bone Golems is my Archimandrite, since it has to be restricted, if I want to take any of their special things that she takes, any of our ghost units or anything, then I'm not taking them because the Archimandrite's not taking 2 mainstays for me, ever. I have too many other things I want to run. I don't have the space for 2 mainstays from her. So I personally prefer them. What I will say, if you're loving your Varangian Guard, your Bone Golems might not be a bad addition. Or if you're loving your Archimandrite, your Bone Golems are not a bad addition because they fit a little bit of a different purpose. They can hit things that you want them to work with, and it frees up some points of other things. If you are taking the Fallen Divinity, I think a Buccephaloi unit is almost a net must-take because of how good they are. If you're taking a Hierodeacon, I think they're almost a must-take. So if you're moving away from Zilliarch, and you're especially not being Varangian Guard sort of units, then I think you absolutely do lean into the Buccephaloi, for sure. Especially because the Zilliarch is the only one who takes the Varangian Guard. So if you're not doing that sort of avenue, I think then you are absolutely looking at probably having to have a unit Buccephaloi. I think if you don't, in the current game where we have a lot more units out, no Buccephaloi, no Varangian Guard, and again, I'm not counting some of the stuff that isn't out yet, we could get into some of that. With those, I think you're struggling. Unless you're bringing Fallen Divinity, I think you're struggling because people have some big, heavy, strong units that have good saves, especially if you end up going against someone who plays Dweghom. If you're playing Dweghom, you need a way to carve through them. I don't care that the defenses aren't as high. If you can't carve through it with their good resolves, you're not getting anywhere. You're not going to have a fun game. And I absolutely think that Buccephaloi are almost, you really need to use them. If you don't own one yet, proxy them, try them out, give them a shot, see what you think of them. Bone Golems, I think they're a fun choice. A little bit annoying to paint. I do think they're a fun choice, but I think they're a much more niche choice in this army. Where I think, at least for now that we have these Buccephaloi, they're in almost all my lists. Bone Golems are when I want to spice it up and I want to run maybe some ghosts as well, and I really want to run a sort of a more weird list. So, for Bone Golems, my list there, the one I've taken in the past, I take a mainstay of Legionnaires. This is a spot where sometimes I take Cares as well, and then I can take the Bone Golems with them. From that, what I've often done then is a Zilliarch with usually then some Varangian Guard and kind of fill out the rest from there. If I'm taking Buccephaloi, my current list has had Buccephaloi, Anatheti, Archimandrite, a Hierodeacon, and usually a Certigos. Sometimes Zilliarch, sometimes I actually do run all 4. If not, I will drop usually maybe, if not there's Certigos, maybe the Zilliarch, and then I don't run the Varangian Guard. But that's a little bit more of what my list looks like. If anyone actually wants to see lists made with the units when I talk about them, let me know. I can always show that. I don't know if that's of interest. I talk a little bit about list ideas, but we can do a deeper dive of exact list concepts, exact list ideas. If people want to have your list looked at, obviously we can do that kind of stuff as well. I keep this as free form and going about whatever I want to talk about at the time. All right, I think that belabors those points enough. So, like I said, they both fill a little bit of a different role. I prefer Buccephaloi personally right now. Maybe when we see some more units out, maybe that'll change. But currently, they're a little darling that I love to run. And I put them in almost every list first. And then I fill out the rest of my list because they're also they're great looking models and they're so fun to paint. All right, if you enjoyed this or other want other Conquest content or anything like that, like I said, if you are watching on YouTube, notes below, you can mark down what you're looking for. You can leave comments about what you would like to see and all of that. If you're looking on podcatchers, obviously you can go there as well to just let me know the sorts of things that you want discussed. If it comes to Conquest, let me know what you want to see. If it comes to other games, tell us as well. If you have been enjoying our content, we do ask that you subscribe if you haven't done so yet on YouTube. We're getting close to 900, which is getting close to 1,000, which is when YouTube actually cares about you and you start showing up in searches easily and all that sort of stuff. So I would like to be at least 900 before the year ends, and maybe early next year get to that 1,000 mark. That's something that tells me like we're doing it right when it kind of gets to that. If you're trying to buy either of these units or anything else from Parabellum Games and you don't have either friendly local game store or anything like that, I said underneath this on the I usually put it in the podcatcher as well. It's there as well as on YouTube. Is a link you can click on. You have our code you can put in at checkout. Terrain Kickers get you 10% off on any of your purchases that you're doing through Parabellum Games website, as well as it helps out the show as well. Honestly, that it really does do quite a bit, and it's helped us be able to get some of the equipment we need for the battle reports that we're working on. The Christmas season's been crazy, but we're going to start doing some Imperialis battle reports hopefully next week. I want to get back to doing more Conquest stuff, battle reports wise. I'm hoping again in January to start getting into more of that and doing more of those. The problem is I don't have a space to do it, so I have to be able to work out spaces to do that. I'm working on getting more reliability to be able to do that. So, all right, I think that does it enough for me. So, on behalf of everyone here then at the show, have a good hobby and some great gaming.